Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our evening program on the Vatican, the Holocaust, and World War II, Uncovering the Secret History. We are delighted to welcome you here to Park Avenue Synagogue, and in partnership with our partner Toli, the Olga Langel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights. I'm Rabbi Kaufman, Director of Content and Innovation at Park Avenue, and I know for a fact that this is going to be a wonderful program. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here in person, and we know that actually we have many of you online, and we are grateful to all of you for your attendance and for your presence for this program. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the great 20th century theologian, Rav Soloveitchik, wrote a seminal piece entitled Kol Dodi Dofek, My Beloved Knocks. Using the language and the imagery of the biblical book Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, and the rabbinic interpretation of that book, that God and Israel are in a love affair, Soloveitchik imagines God, 8 years after the Holocaust, finally emerging from what he calls a night of total divine self-concealment to knock at our door. And with that knocking, the state of Israel was born. So too, after tonight's discussion of the Holocaust, we here at Park Avenue will transition to a discussion of the creation of the State of Israel and its foundational document, its Declaration of Independence, the Megillat Ha'atzmaut, this Sunday. So please join us this Sunday from 10 to noon as we delve into the text that is the core of Israel's existence and what it means in light of what is happening in Israel today. And now I'd like to introduce my friend, my colleague, the Executive Director of Toli.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaufman. It's delightful to be back here at Park Avenue Synagogue and to see so many faces that I used to interact with when I was a member here. As Rabbi Kaufman said, Toli it's an acronym for the Olga Langel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights. Olga was a survivor of Auschwitz, and she wrote one of the first accounts of what it was like to be in the camps. She actually published it 1947 in Paris, and it's called The Five Chimneys. It's been translated throughout the world. I can tell you that last week, the Greek government actually announced the publication of the book in Greece and has distributed it throughout the country there. The programs that we do are basically professional development programs for educators. We teach educators throughout the United States and Europe how to teach the Holocaust. For years, people have rallied, we need to mandate Holocaust education without giving enough thought to what does that mean? How do you make it relevant for our students today? How do you use that lens to talk to them about extremism, anti-Semitism, fascism? And so the teachers come to our seminars. We have 14 regional seminars running this summer and 10 throughout Europe this summer. So Rabbi Kaufman mentioned I think we've heard over 1,000 people who are joining us virtually tonight. Many of them, several hundred, are Toli educators from our network. And I want to take this opportunity to just say thank you to these teachers. We talk about the Holocaust and saying never again. That's one of our 11th commandment, and I want to thank these teachers for your dedication to making Holocaust education important for teachers here in this country and around the world. So the teachers that we're talking about are in Montana, Idaho, Albuquerque, Tulsa. These are places that don't normally get education of the quality that Toli provides. So I'm sure all of you are watching the news, what's happening in various states with the pushback about teaching about the history of slavery and racism in this country. And these are the teachers on the front line that we're dealing with, and we're mentoring them for how do you have these discussions. So tonight's program is dedicated to talking about truth and facts that are often uncomfortable, but it's critically important to face. So it's my honor to be able to introduce our speakers tonight, and I'm sure you're well aware of their histories, but it's worth letting you know who you're going to be hearing from on this esteemed panel. Abe Foxman is the National Director Emeritus of the Anti-Defamation League, where he served for 50 years with the organization, including as the National Director from 1987 to 2015. Full disclosure, I'm proud to say that he was my boss for 16 of those years at the ADL. Abe is a world-renowned leader in the fight against anti-Semitism, bigotry, and discrimination. Throughout his career and now into his retirement, he's been called upon by world leaders for his advice and counsel, and by media for his take on Jewish issues. He's received numerous awards and honors, including France's highest civilian honor, the Knight of the Legion of Honor, which I actually didn't know. We always thought of Abe as our knight in shining armor, but I didn't know, Abe, that you were actually a knight. So this evening, you're going to hear about Abe's early childhood in Belarus, which was obviously impacted by the policies of the Vatican. When his family survived the Holocaust and came to the US, Abe became quintessential New York. He attended Yeshiva of Flatbush in Brooklyn, he went to City College, New York, and he got his law degree at NYU Law School. He's the author of 4 books on anti-Semitism and numerous articles on matters of concern to the Jewish communities worldwide. David Kertzer is an American anthropologist, historian, and academic specializing in the political, demographic, and religious history of Italy. He's considered one of the world's leading authorities on the history of the Vatican and its relations with the Jews. His book, The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for biography or autobiography. He also authored the fascinating book, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortera. His most recent book, which will be the focus of the discussion this evening, The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pope Pius XII, Mussolini and Hitler, and it was published last year by Random House. Professor Kertzer is a graduate of Brown University. He received his PhD in anthropology from Brandeis and then taught at Bowdoin College for 18 years. He returned to his undergraduate alma mater in 1982 and has remained at Brown, now serving as the Paul Dupuy Jr. University Professor of Social Science, Professor of Anthropology, and Professor of Italian Studies. And then, of course, last but not least, Rabbi Cosgrove, who began his dynamic tenure at Park Avenue Synagogue in 2008. Through his wisdom, humor, insightful sermons, and other writings, he has become a leading voice in the conservative movement of Judaism and beyond. In 2015, he was selected to represent the Jewish community when Pope Francis visited the National September 11th Memorial Museum here in New York. Rabbi Cosgrove, it's my pleasure now to turn the program over to you to engage Abe Foxman and Professor David Kertzer in a discussion about a previous pope.
Thank you, Deborah. Deborah, it's wonderful to welcome you back to this Bima. You are always welcome here. Just to be clear, the fact that Deborah is no longer a member of Park Avenue Synagogue is about geography, not about theology. Her move to Brooklyn was a hard move for us all, but it's great to have you back in the sanctuary, and thank you for your leadership of the Olga Langel Institute. May you go from strength to strength in all that you do. Abe, it is wonderful to welcome you here. You have been a presence on this Bima over the years, and it's great to have you back and keep our friendship personally and institutionally strong. And to Professor Kertzer, it is great to have you here. I wish you mazal tov on the new publication. It is very exciting to welcome you here to Park Avenue Synagogue for this very important conversation. I want to actually begin with you, which is we'll start with a softball. I thoroughly enjoyed, and I haven't read it 100%. It's a big book, but I get the sense of it, and it is eminently readable and a fabulous addition to the scholarship on the subject, The Pope at War. Can you tell us just the story of how this book came into being?
Well, there's both a kind of personal aspect to the story, which also indirectly has to do with Park Avenue Synagogue, and I'd say professional or scholarly. The personal is that my father was in the war as a Jewish chaplain. He was a rabbi. He was a Jewish chaplain with the forces, the Allied forces that landed at Anzio beachhead, which was 30 miles south of Rome, more or less, and then was with them as they liberated Rome, and then, along with the chief rabbi of Rome, presided over the first service in a liberated synagogue of Europe. So I grew up hearing stories about the war and about Italy in the war, and about, of course, the Jews in the war. Also, my father then, after the war, became the associate rabbi to Milton Steinberg, who was the chief rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue. So my father was actually, that's why I'm sitting here feeling a little dazed, because he was
There's a glass of water there if you need it.
Right. He was here as the associate rabbi for a number of years. And actually during those years, my family, the year before I was born, adopted, or would have adopted if there were legal papers. So my foster sister, who was a sole survivor of Auschwitz, a Hungarian family whose parents and siblings were all murdered at Auschwitz. So there's the kind of personal aspect of the interest in the subject we're talking about tonight. But then also I'm an Italian historian and someone who's been interested in the kind of politics of the Vatican, more generally in the relationship of the Vatican to Italian politics for the last 2 centuries. As many of you here know, the controversy over the silence of the Pope during the war and during the Holocaust has been a big controversy for many years. It probably began publicly in 1963. Don't know if any of you can remember this or are old enough, when a German playwright, Rolf Hochhuth, put out a play, The Deputy, which, by the way, was banned in Italy and not performed in Italy as a result of church pressure. But that's what portrayed a pope who, although being begged by a more junior priest to say something publicly against the extermination of the Jews of Europe that was underway, refused to do so. The church angrily reacted to this. They commissioned, the Pope at the time, Paul VI, commissioned between 1965 and 1981, so over those years, what ended up being 12 thick volumes of the selected papers from the Vatican Archives for World War II. Papers, archives that were not open to the general scholarly community, but just to a group of 4 Jesuit scholars. And then basically said, well, we've published everything from those archives, so why do you keep insisting we need to open these archives? A few years after that, in 1999, John Cornwell published a book some of you may be familiar with the provocative title, Hitler's Pope. And this just further, of course, blew up this argument. Jewish organizations and other organizations have been begging the Vatican for years now to open those Vatican archives. I kind of made a bet. I had done an earlier book, as was mentioned, about his predecessor, the man who became the Pope. Pius XII was, as Eugenio Pacelli, a cardinal, was the number 2 to his predecessor. He served as Secretary of State throughout the 1930s before he became Pope in 1939. And my earlier book was about that Pope and his relations with the Italian fascist regime. So he was already kind of a major player for me. And I kind of made a bet at a certain point after finishing that book that Pope Francis, as part of his attempt to greater transparency for the church, would finally bow to the pressure and open those archives. So I started working in the other archives that were already open, all the Italian fascist archives, the German archives, the British archives, the American archives, the French archives. Each of these places, by the way, each of these countries had an ambassador or envoy to the Vatican who was sending more or less daily reports back to their government in Berlin, in Rome, in France, in London, in Washington, reporting about their conversations with the Pope and with the men right around the Pope, the prelates around the Pope. There weren't any women, really, in this group. And their conversations. And in my book, what I try to do is basically recreate the drama in the Vatican almost on a day-to-day basis throughout the war of what they were hearing, the pressures on them, including to speak out about the Holocaust, and why they decided to do what they did. So that may be a little bit of a long answer how I went about this and why I wanted to write the book.
Well, thank you. I have about 8,000 follow-up questions for you, but we have time, so I'm not going to rush this conversation. Abe, you, if I'm not mistaken, have had 8 private audiences with popes. And so when you hear Professor Kertzer's brief synopsis of the history of getting access to the documents, to the Vatican archives, was this the subject matter of your interactions with the Vatican? Can you give us a little inside baseball about what your own experience was in your leadership tenure?
If I may, I'm going to step back a little bit. I'm sitting here and survived to a large extent, if you will, because of the Catholic Church. Not the Vatican, as I've learned reading your book. And I was hidden, protected by a Catholic Polish woman. There was a priest, a Catholic priest, which I'm still looking for, who had the courage, the decency, the heroism to baptize me, to protect me. And so I've always had this personal sense of awe and respect for what my nanny did and for this unknown priest. But it wasn't until I read your book, Professor, that my respect grew overwhelming. Because I now realize that their heroism was much, much greater than I ever thought. Because they were acting against the church. They were acting out of faith. But the church was sending no signals to save Jews, to protect Jews, to embrace Jews. There was silence. It was worse than silence when you read the book. And so my appreciation, Professor, of my own personal survival is that much greater because I now have this greater sense of the heroism of those individuals who risked their lives. Rabbi, I also have a sort of a weird Beshert journey to this, because it was Pope Pius and this controversy that brought me to the Anti-Defamation League. Mm-hmm. So when I was in law school, one of the employees of the ADL, Dr. Joseph Lichten, who was a former member of the Polish Parliament, who was the interfaith director of the ADL, wrote a pamphlet called A Question of Judgment in Defense of Pope Pius. And it was a major, major stir and controversy in the Jewish world. This was a time of a major, robust Yiddish press, the Hebrew press. And somebody from the ADL reached out to my father and asked him whether he would do some consulting work for the ADL in translating a text from Yiddish and Hebrew on the ADL. And my father, Zechlon Levracha, said, no, but maybe my son would. And so my affiliation with the ADL was for $15 an article. I was translating a text, how un-Jewish and how understanding and lack of history the ADL was. As a result of that, when I graduated law school, I called Dr. Lichten and I said, are there any jobs in the ADL after reading the other side of the ADL? How ironic and beshert it is that 50, 60 years later, I'm in the presence of the greatest scholar of that era and that period. Now, to answer your question specifically, at every audience, maybe it wasn't the first request, the first demand, but the question of opening the archives, the real archives, not the archives that they opened. So it was always a demand, a request, respectfully, etc. I don't know of any Jewish organization that had the opportunity to meet with any of the popes who did not put this number 1 and number 2 on the agenda.
And when it finally happened, Professor, we're going to get to the contents of it, but I love this stuff, and my background is in archival research. Was it sort of this Geniza moment? Did the lights go on? Was it like Indiana Jones that you walk in there and you open up a book that no one has ever seen before, or am I being too cinematic about this? Did Pope Francis just sort of wave you in and have a little kiddish and say, come in? Like, how did the deal go down? Yes. And then we'll get into the contents of the
Well, not exactly. So they were opened March 2nd, 2020, which, by the way, Italy was at the epicenter of what was then a new disease that was going around. And so they ended up, after I worked there a week, I'd been waiting for years to get in there, as some of my colleagues were. And after a week, it was closed, but luckily reopened after 3 months. But luckily, people say, well, there are 15 or 20 million pieces of paper in these newly opened Pius XII archives. How can you publish a book after just a couple of years? It'll take decades to do a fair job here. Often the people who say this, who are defenders of Pius XII, have actually already written biographies of Pius XII before they even opened the archives, but that hasn't stopped them from making this argument. Luckily, the professional archivists there have created quite good, what they call finding aids. So you have to be, it takes a while to understand their system. It's not like there's something online or a single catalog. There are hundreds of different volumes of indexes to this and that. But if you know what to look, if you do have experience there and know what to look for, you can, for example, the Italian fascist regime's ambassador to the Holy See, his papers about his meeting with the nuncio's papers, I should say, his meetings with the prime minister, the foreign minister, and so on. So on the one hand, I have from the state archives, working in the state archives, they're already open, the Mussolini's ambassador or Hitler's ambassador to the Holy See, their regular reports. But then for the same days and the same events, I now have for example, the nuncio's reports of his meetings with Mussolini, with Mussolini's son-in-law, who was the foreign minister, and so on. So what you're now able to do is put together these documents from these different sources, including, very importantly, the Vatican Archive, but not only the Vatican Archive, because if you just looked at the Vatican Archives, there's certain things you would never find out. You never find out about some of the backbiting. You never find out about some of the personalities the way you do from these other reports. But putting them together is what I think makes this so valuable. And what I did discover, I mean, talking about the question of the Vatican saying, oh, we already published these 12 volumes, what more do you want? I found out that they, in fact, left out very incriminating documents. They left out, even from documents they published, they would all of a sudden put ... and then an asterisk and said, we've omitted some personal details. And the personal details were vicious anti-Semitic language. It had nothing to do with anything personal at all. So, it was eye-opening, and there were some real little shockers that...
Yeah, so let's get into that. Let's get into the document. So what were the shockers? What was the state of play prior to these documents, and what were some of the major aha, wow moments of saying our understanding of the Pope at war is now forever changed? I have a list of them, but yeah, you wrote the book.
Let me give a couple of examples. One, maybe the most shocking and most amazing that they could have kept secret for 80 years is that 5 weeks after Eugenio Pacelli was elected Pius XII, so now we're in early 1939, Hitler saw an opportunity for reasons we could get into, but the previous Pope Pius XI had grown increasingly aggressive against Hitler and against the Nazis and against Mussolini's embrace of the Nazis. And
he was actually going to publish an encyclical right before his death, is that right?
Right. He had asked actually an American Jesuit who was known for his anti-racist work in the U.S. to draft an encyclical denouncing racism and anti-Semitism. And it was actually on the Pope's desk at the time that the Pope died, Pius XI died, and one of the things that his successor did was bury that. That didn't see the light of day.
No one's ever seen it.
Well, scholars have now seen the draft, but for many decades no one had, and it was, of course, never published. So Hitler, but for example, in those last couple of months of his life, Pius XI had the Vatican Daily newspaper day after day have very critical articles about the Nazi Germany. Now, it had nothing to do with Jews, but it had to do with the fact that Nazi Germany, from his point of view, was persecuting the Catholic Church in Germany and closing down seminaries, closing down parochial schools and so forth, because he wanted to Nazify the country. So the first thing that Pius XII did when he was elected, we didn't have to go in the archives to know, but if you read the editions of the Vatican Daily newspaper, he ordered the Vatican newspaper no longer to publish any critical articles about Germany. So Mussolini, seeing this and seeing some other signs of opportunity for understanding better relations, decided to send a secret envoy to negotiate with the Pope. This was kept secret till my book came out. I mean, it's kind of amazing, really. A very colorful character, a Nazi prince who was the great-grandson of Queen Victoria of England, among other things, but he also was married to the daughter of the King of Italy. And so
Von Hessen.
Von Hessen, name was von Hessen, and von Hessen met many times with the Pope. And amazingly, that not only did I find out that he met with him, but the Pope, maybe not trusting or for whatever his reasons, kept a German prelate, probably a Jesuit, in an adjoining room, and he recorded their conversations. They spoke in German, by the way. The Pope, Pius XII, had spent 12 years as papal nuncio in Germany. From 1917 to 1929, so he's fluent in German, knew Germany very well. So what I discovered were these transcriptions, essentially, of their conversations that they had never been, they didn't know they existed, let alone that there existed these kinds of records of them. So that was probably the most striking finding. But just one other thing I'd mention is that were kept out of those volumes that were published is the Pope had a man that he called on regularly, repeatedly, when issues of Jews, including the Holocaust-related issues, came up. A man who would later become Cardinal Vicar of Rome, so had a very successful career in the church. This man, Monsignor Dell'Acqua, was a fierce anti-Semite, and in the, for example, after in the end of November of 1943, when the Germans were occupying Italy, much of Italy, I think November 30th, 1943, that fascist government under Mussolini, the puppet government that was set up, ordered the arrest of all Jews and the sending of all Jews in Italy to concentration camps. And one of the prelates in the Vatican called on the Pope to speak out about this. And what we now find is this memo, long memo, that was not published in those 12 volumes, which is from the Pope's major advisor on Jewish affairs, filled with anti-Semitic language saying you should not say anything. So I think we now know a lot more than we used to.
Please.
After reading your book, I understood much deeper than I ever did why they would not open up the archives. Because they knew. They had access. The clergy in the Vatican, the Curia knew. And so knowing what we now know, thanks to you and opening, I understand why they wanted to protect it. What I have difficulty understanding is why, and the last popes, compared to the popes that you've written about with the Jews, were so unique, why they promoted to sainthood, to beatitude, knowing what they knew. How could they, okay, you don't open it up, don't talk about it, but to promote sainthood and beatitude for someone who they knew the details that we now know, it's still my mind. And maybe that's your next book. To what extent did Nostra Aetate, Vatican II, the quote-unquote forgiving of the Jews in our lifetime, post-Holocaust, to what extent did this history play in getting this done in our lifetime? And I'll go one step further. I'm not a scholar, to me, John Paul was super unique in terms of his sensitivity to the Jewish community, to Jewish history. Maybe it is because he was witness personally to Nazism and persecution of Jews. But to what extent is, and what he did is change their beliefs by going to synagogue. Probably the most dramatic act in terms of changing the history of the church, which was the major element in anti-Semitism in Western civilization, was not Nostra Aetate, but the popes going to visit the synagogue. Because it said to Christianity that contrary to what they all said, that the only way to salvation is through Jesus and the church. And all of a sudden, this pope comes and says the Jews have their own road to salvation, and the synagogue and their religion is. And his sensitivity. So I'll share with you something that I've learned. When the Pope decided to go to the synagogue, he found a classmate, a neighbor of Rabbi Toaf, the chief rabbi of Rome, summoned him for a meeting, and said to him, I want you to do me a favor. I've decided to visit the synagogue, but I don't want to write a letter or send a messenger to the chief rabbi to say, I want to come, because that will force him to say yes. So you're his friend, you're his classmate, you're his neighbor. Tell him this is what I want to do. But if he's not comfortable, I will not do it. Wow, what sensitivity. And the chief rabbi polled the rabbis of Europe, and they all said yes. I'll tell you, I'll finish with another sensitivity. The first audience that I went to with John Paul, and when I asked him to bless the soul of my nanny, he came off the chair, embraced me, and held me on and said, it's so important to bear witness to goodness in the church. Okay? But at the end, everybody gets a memento. And we were with a American-Polish group to establish a Jan Karski Award. And the Polish Catholics received a coin, a medallion. And we, the Jews, received an art book on Rubens. And I collect coins. So, and as I walked out, I said to the Monsignor, why didn't we get a coin? And he said, because the medallion had a crucifix. And the Pope was concerned that giving this gift to the Jews would offend them. Wow. Wow, the sensitivity. And yet, he promoted beatification and sainthood.
Well, you're going to get a book at the end of this evening, Abe.
But I read it.
But you read it, but you'll get a signed copy. So we're skipping over the entire subject matter of the book. So I want to touch on this, and then I'm going to come back to the book. Abe, I heard in your question 2 questions that either you or Professor, if you could touch on. Knowing what you know now and what was hidden from the public, right? Question number 1 is, to what degree was the they of the Vatican aware of what you discovered, right? We're assuming, and you're embedded in your question, Abe, that everyone knew what the professor, right? So to what degree was it known that what was being kept hidden? And number 2 is looking at Nostra Aetate, if they knew what was being hidden and the either inaction or the misdeeds of the Vatican during World War II of the Pope, to what degree now do we revisit that history of Jewish-Catholic dialogue, knowing that this was sort of in the substratum hidden? Was that English?
Yep.
Yes. Well, I do.
And then we'll get to the book.
Right.
And then there's a question of consequence for us.
Yeah, there are a bunch of questions there. I mean, I do think, say, John Paul II he may not have seen the particular documents, but I think he knew pretty much the kind of things that were being hidden, and knew why as well. He did, the year 2000, September 3rd, I remember well, for various reasons, he was going to make, for part of the second millennium celebrations of the church in Rome, he was going to beatify 2 predecessors, one the hero of kind of the liberals of the church, John the 23rd, and the other Pius XII, hero of the conservatives of the church. Pressure, largely from the Jewish community in Italy, I think, but more generally international Jewish community probably made him decide, well, let's wait till the archives open, and instead he took a 19th century conservative hero, Pope Pius IX, and beatified him. More recently, the I think it was Pope Benedict actually took the next step for Pius XII, made him venerable, which means people could pray to him and so forth. So why did they do this, knowing what they know? Well, I think, first of all, Pius XII, I think from the Jewish point of view, of course, focus on the warriors of the Holocaust, but from the church point of view, he was Pope till 1958. He did a lot of other things from a theological perspective, from a certain kind of religious perspective, may be very praiseworthy, but having nothing to do with his role in the war. So there's that. I think it's also, there's a narrative that the Vatican is stuck to, which, by the way, the Catholic Church in Germany and in France and I think some other parts of Europe have abandoned. That is, they have begun to come to terms with this history, but the Vatican and the Italian Church have not. And that is that they had, Pope Pius XII supported the Italian clergy that supported the Axis war. I mean, the Italians didn't want to go to war and this is something I discovered. I wasn't quite sure of this because I'm always skeptical of after the war, nobody was a fascist and so on. Well, did the Italians really want to go to war to defend Aryan supremacy? Did the Sicilians think of themselves as Aryans that the Nazis were talking about? They just fought a war where 500,000 Italians were killed, not much more than 20 years earlier, World War I against Germany. So Mussolini was going to have a great problem convincing Italians to go to war at Hitler's side. How did he get support? Not a small matter was the fact that the entire clergy, from the cardinals, the archbishops, bishops, all said to the Italians and through their church bulletins and the national Catholic publications and the sermons that it's your duty as Catholics to go to war and do your Catholic duty. The Pope was, there's no other head of the Italian, it's not like Poland where there's a primate, a cardinal, there's no cardinal primate in Italy because cardinal primate in essence is the Pope. So he basically was playing, I didn't say this in the book because it's maybe not appropriate in a book of history, but he's playing a double game. That he needed to be neutral in the war, he said. For one thing, his major financing was coming from the American church. So in any case, even if he were more positively inclined toward the Nazis than he actually was, that was an issue for him. So he was able to maintain this notion, I can't take sides in the war, but in fact, as head of the Italian church, he was taking sides in the war. This can't be acknowledged today in the church in Italy or by the Vatican. So there's a lot here that once you ask a pope today to get into it is very embarrassing and goes totally against their narrative, that's their official narrative, including the 1998 document that they put out on the Holocaust, We Remember, and that was John Paul II. He commissioned there was or maybe still is, I guess, a Vatican committee for religious relations with Jews, head of it, Cardinal at the time, Cardinal Cassidy. 11 years they studied this question. Did the vilification of Jews by the church have anything to do with making the Holocaust possible? And their answer, the 1998 document, which he wrote the preface to, the Pope himself, said, oh no, these are two different things. There used to be, unfortunately, some anti-Judaism, but that had nothing to do with the Holocaust, which was caused by modern anti-Semitism, which was, in fact, anti-Catholic. Totally untrue reading of history, but this remains the official position of the church.
I have a question. The Jewish community was worked up on getting the files open. Survivors, organized Jewish community, Israel, come every day, every opportunity. So you write the book. They open up the files, and you write the book. And it's a blockbuster in terms of everything that we feared, we wanted to know, and now we know. And I thought that it would shake our world. And I don't understand. Well, I somewhat understand. The survivors are no longer who they were during the years. Israel has different interests. The head of Yad Vashem recently visited the Vatican after your book came out, and there was not a word, not a mention. And so your contribution to what we begged for, pleaded for, people of history, you bring it out. And you're the scholar of scholars on this subject, and I'm sure you're getting all kinds of brickbats, etc. But to the scholarly world, this is it. And I don't understand. I don't understand. I wish it'd be a bestseller, but I'm talking from a perspective of right and wrong. I just don't understand that there isn't this outrage of what you are now told was.
Well, you know, one aspect, I mean, you mentioned Israel, and yeah, I don't entirely know the answer to that, but I'm glad you raised the subject. I wrote a book, came out now 20 years ago, called The Popes Against the Jews, on the role of the Vatican in the origins of modern anti-Semitism, which we generally date to about the 1880s and on. And the book, which was published by Knopf, and we organized, or the publisher organized, a launch in New York with a very distinguished panel of scholars and public intellectuals, and it was going to be held at the Jewish Center of NYU, Hillel Center, which was called the Montreal Jewish... Bronfman Center. A week before the launch event, my publicist at the publisher, Knopf, called up and said, it's been canceled. I said, what happened? He said, well, I got a call from the executive director, and that they decided that this wasn't the moment to talk about a book that might be seen as offensive to the Catholic Church. Why? Because Israel needs the Vatican support. And so, you know, it's not our high priority. We have a higher priority. So I wonder, luckily, another institution at NYU, we moved to like a block and had the launch, and it didn't really affect things from the book point of view, but it was a little bit of a shaking experience for me, that for the reasons you mentioned, you think that this is something the Jewish community wants to get to the bottom of and understand, and try to get the larger world to understand, because what did make the Holocaust possible? It was centuries of demonization of Jews. Who were the people who killed the Jews? They were Christians. They weren't people who thought they were Sunday. They weren't people who thought they were pagans. They thought they were Protestants. They thought they were Catholic. This, for me, this is the responsibility of the church that they're unwilling to admit to. So we get no sense that it was. I mean, the Third Reich. By the time they also had Austria, which very willingly became part of the Third Reich, it was well over 40% Catholic. So, and that's what the German clergy recently admitted to. The German clergy, 2.5 years ago, the hierarchy of the German Catholic Church came out with a statement admitting and asking forgiveness for the fact that they had not only been responsible for demonization of Jews, but in the war never spoke out against the attempt by German troops to exterminate the Jews of Europe. So, this is kind of a sad fact, from my point of view, about the organized Jewish community, at least right now, that we don't see this as a priority for the world to come to terms with how the Holocaust happened.
But are there consequences? Is there anything? What could we ask for? We ask for the Vatican to do what the Church of Germany and France did? Is that possible? Can we ask them? I read, or some rabbi said that Pope Pius should be disinterred from the burial of the popes. But following that, based on your book, the popes and the Jews, half of the popes would have to be disinterred. Yeah. So that's absurd. But could we even ask and say a declaration from them that Pope Pius never be beatified? I don't know what are the consequences of knowing what we now know?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the Jewish community, I don't think it's particularly appropriate to say who should be made a saint in the Catholic Church. So I'm sometimes asked that question. In fact, on Monday, I have a somewhat embarrassing assignment, which is in the evening, I'm doing a book presentation, but I was asked while I was in St. Louis, they heard at St. Louis University I was going to be there. St. Louis University is a Jesuit university, and they, do you know what the name of their library is?
Pius?
The Pope Pius XII Library. And there's a big statue, apparently, I'll see it on Monday, a big statue of Pius XII in the middle of the campus. So partly due to my book, but partly due to other things, there'd been a movement about let's rename the library and so on. So they've organized for noon on Monday a round table where there are two Jesuit theologians and me speaking about the legacy of Pius XII. And I said, whatever you do, don't ask me, should you take down your statue, should you rename your library? I mean, that's your business, but I'll tell you the story, but that's up to you. To me, the important thing is for the Church and the Vatican itself to come to terms with its role in the demonization of the Jews and its role to basically scrap We Remember and replace it with a statement that actually deals with the real history.
Unless they think Vatican II and going to the synagogue did it.
Yes, well, I mean, that gets back to the earlier question of, who was it who was responsible for Vatican II and for Nostra Aetate? It was two men, Pope John the 23rd, Angelo Roncalli. He was, through much of the Holocaust, based in Istanbul, and he actually did do a lot to try to rescue Jews during the war. And then his successor, so he died, he calls the Vatican Council together, he becomes Pope on the death of Pius XII in 1958, he dies in 1963. Then who's elected the new Pope? It's a man named Giovanni Battista Montini, who had been kind of number 2 in the Secretary of State office during World War II, and is a major character in my book, major player in this history. And he's the one responsible for continuing the Second Vatican Council and for the statement of Nostra Aetate in 1965. So I do think that that Montini, maybe I'm wrong, felt a certain amount of guilt about all this, that this played a role, that Roncalli saw what had happened, and Pius XII. In fact, in my book, I talk about a meeting. We see this document that Roncalli writes that he met with the Pope during actually relatively early years of the Holocaust. I think this was maybe 41 or 42, and he was talking about the massacre going on of the Jews of Europe. And he said the Pope was virtually crying, saying, what are people going to say about me if I don't speak out? So the question of the silence of the Pope, by the way, was not a new question with Rolf Hachul's play in 1963. It began at the beginning of the war and began actually having nothing to do with Jews. It began the day after the invasion of largely Catholic Poland, where one of the first things the Nazis did in the lands that they wanted to annex to the Third Reich was arrest hundreds of priests and send them into concentration camps because they were seen as leaders of local resistance by Polish nationalists. And so the Polish clergy, including the Polish political leadership, was begging the Pope to speak out to denounce the Nazi invasion and the mass arrests of priests, and the Pope refused. So this is also part of the history.
And so he refused, so he was pressured to protect the German Catholic clergy, right? That was the internal pressure because to speak out would have put their position, they were being charged with, whether it's abuse or misdeeds, and there was both you describe a political and a legal moment there, but then when it came to the Polish Catholic clergy, the Pope remains. So I'm trying to understand sort of the various internal and external pressures that might have prompted
and he did
the Pope's
protect
silence.
baptized Jews.
Yeah, I want to get to that again. Yes.
Yeah, right. So the Pope, as I mentioned, had spent 12 years in Germany as nuncio. He was very close to the conservative elite, Catholic elite in the country. Was not close to the Nazis, and the Cornwell's title, Hitler's Pope, is, I think, totally inappropriate. He was no fan of the Nazis, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was the invasion of Poland by the Germans was very popular in Germany, and especially when they were so successful so quickly. And so the Pope was afraid of, not only was Hitler able to intimidate the Pope, as Mussolini was too. I think in that sense the Pope was a rather weak character. But he was worried about creating a schism in the Catholic Church in Germany. And the Catholic Church in Germany was seen as particularly valuable from the Vatican perspective, and particularly at risk for various reasons. So this was largely the reason he kept silent. So when we talk about the silence of the Pope in the Holocaust, and people say, is this because of anti-Semitism? I think it's, there is a role played by anti-Semitism there, but there's something else going on as well.
Right. And then when the Pope actually became aware of the atrocities being committed against the Jews, when the actual roundup of Italian Jewry occurred, even though the atrocities were of an increased nature, his silent. I mean, was there a hero at any point? Was there anyone who was, at this moment, or any moment that you read about that he said, maybe now's the time that I need to speak?
No, I mean, there were, as Abe, you mentioned, there were certainly heroic individual figures in the Catholic Church, including priests. And there were many Jews who were saved in convents and so forth. Many Jews also were turned away by the convents, and quite a few Jews were baptized in the convents, which is, again, maybe we can talk about. So it's a little bit of a complicated story there. But the Pope, we now knew very early about, he had very good sources in occupied Europe, of course, filled with the Catholic, capillary parishes and parish priests and bishops and so on. So they're sending in reports. And we now know that he knew very early on that the Germans were systematically trying to exterminate Europe's Jews. And many of the horrifying details, not all the horrifying details of what was going on in some of the concentration camps, but the fact that millions of Jews were being slaughtered systematically, he knew pretty much from the beginning. But, I think this comes to a head in a way on October 16, 1943, with the roundup of Rome's Jews. Because, so the Germans have occupied the month earlier, in September 43, they've occupied much of Italy. One of the first things Hitler orders is he orders SS into Rome to round up all of Rome's Jews to send them to their extermination, to be sent to Auschwitz. And so 350 SS on October 16th, Shabbos morning, go house to house. They have lists of all the Jews of Rome, and seize them, little children, old people, everybody they can get their hands on, send them to a holding facility, which is actually a military college just outside the walls of Vatican City, and hold them there for two days. So the Pope, for one thing, the popes, who of course had ruled as Pope kings in the Papal States that lasted 1,000 years till 1870, they had always considered themselves as kind of protectors of the Jews. At the same time, they put them in ghettos and so forth, but so it was particularly embarrassing for the Pope that the Jews were being rounded up, and he knew what was going to happen to them. And so he sends his Secretary of State that same morning that they're rounded up. He tells him to call in Hitler's ambassador, the German ambassador to the Holy See, and see what he could do. And we have that Cardinal Secretary of State's own more or less transcription of his conversation with Hitler's ambassador, in which he says, this is really terrible. The Pope is really sad about this. Can you do something? And the German ambassador says, well, this order came from the very top, namely from Hitler. Do you really want me to protest? And the cardinal says, well, no, I didn't say that. And what happens over the next 2 days, and we know this in good part now due to these recently opened archives that I've been able to read, why is it they didn't put they rounded up 1,259 Jews that day, that Saturday. Why didn't they just put them on the train, which was waiting for them to take them to Auschwitz? They waited 2 days. And 2 days later, they were put on the train and they were taken directly to Auschwitz, where most were sent directly to the gas chamber on the day of their arrival a week later. But they didn't send them immediately. What did they do? They checked. What did they check? They checked their baptismal credentials. And the Vatican, that we now know, was actively involved in trying to prove that many of them had been baptized, or even, and this was kind of even more surprising to me, had church-authorized sanctioned weddings, Jewish men who had church-sanctioned weddings with Catholic women, which meant that they had pledged to have the children baptized and raised as Catholics. And so 1,259 Jews were not put on that train 2 days later. 1,007 were put on the train. About 250 were let go because, with Vatican help, they were able to show that they had either been baptized, Jews who had been baptized, or Jews who were married to Catholics and promised to raise their kids as Catholic. So this is what actually was happening.
So I'm going to open it up in just one moment. Last question, so everyone can get your questions ready. The finale children, while we're speaking about the baptism, and Abe, I'd love you to weigh in on this as well, because I believe this is sort of a coda to the story in the sense of these children who were baptized, perhaps to save their lives, of whether they were returned, and did Pius XII try to obstruct the return of children to their families?
Yeah, so actually, you talk about striking things that you find when they opened. One of the first sets of files I found was on this finale case. This was a quite well-known case. In fact, I saw in the French press had like 150 articles in 1953, the major newspaper, about this case. So what it was is, but there are many such cases. Finally, the parents were in France, had been sent to Auschwitz where they were murdered. They had left their two children, who were like 1 and 3 years old, in 1944, with a Catholic, with a neighbor, and the children ended up in the care of a Catholic woman. When the Allies liberated France, so even before the end of the war, the surviving siblings of the parents got in touch with this woman and thanked her profusely for helping save the children, which, by the way, weren't yet baptized, and asked to, arrange to pick them up for the family. And she refused, and then she had them baptized. And then she enlisted a network of priests and monks, monasteries and convents, to squirrel them under fake names from one to the other, because the family got the French legal authorities to order their return to their family. So this had been a big scandal. What hadn't been realized until these Vatican archives were just opened in 2020, and which I discovered, is that behind the scenes, the Vatican was actually orchestrating this, keeping the children from their family on exactly these grounds. I had written this earlier book. It was mentioned, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which is a story from 1858 in the Inquisition of a child at age 6 who had presumably been secretly baptized by a Christian servant girl and taken by the Inquisitor on the grounds that a Jewish family couldn't raise a Catholic child. And to see something basically theologically the same argument given a century later was really striking. So this one doesn't know how many of these cases Abe knows personally.
Well, Abe, I'd love you to weigh in.
I'll never know what motivated my nanny at the outset. It started with my parents were ordered into the ghetto. Jews were ordered into the ghetto, and so they were going to go to the ghetto. They were going to take me, and my nanny, who was working for my parents, said, "Well, you know what? You go. It'll be a couple of weeks. I'll take care of them." Well, the couple of weeks were 4 years, and I was circumcised, which was a problem for her, etc. So I think at the beginning it was not Christianity or baptism or saving a soul for the Catholic Church. I think it was a moment. This is her humanity came out. But when my parents survived and they came back for me, and then she said, "I saved him. He belongs to me and the Catholic Church." And I guess we were lucky because it was then in the Soviet liberated Lithuania, and the trial, the court was Soviet communists. So when she pled at the court, at the last resort, "I'm saving a soul for the Catholic Church," they wanted to incarcerate her. They wanted to imprison her because she was a troublemaker, not a heroine. So I think some of these things started on a humanitarian basis, and later the church agitated not to give back. Not to give back. And there was a very serious conflict when the Jewish agency and Jewish institutions sent emissaries to find the children. And in many cases, the church fought them.
All right, let's open it up for a few questions. To remind you, short sentences concluding with a question mark. Pauline, please.
So I have a very quick statement with a question. So there's a question, I promise. So I'm a child of survivors, and I have family members that have the same story of being saved. I also have a story of a cousin who did not have a bris, was immediately given to the nuns, and he was rescued when he was 5. And when at the DP camp with my mother, he was digging, and they go, "What are you digging?" And he says, "I'm digging for a grave for the dirty Jews." So my question is, yes, they took him and they saved him, and yes, they wanted him to become Catholic. But how much anti-Semitism have we learned that was within the church, which was in the convents, that these children were learning not only to be Catholics, but also to hate the Jews?
I'll tell you, I spit. When we walked the streets of Vilna and passed by Jews, I spit. Okay, so I was raised as a tot. Maybe it was for my insurance policy to protect me, but I was taught early on. And when again, these are stories told to me later, when in church on a Sunday, I asked my nanny, then my mother, why is our God poor? And she said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Why is he barefoot? Let's buy him a pair of shoes." Her answer to me was Judas Iscariot with a smack. Okay, so this is the woman risking her life, every single day. Yet when I embarrassed her, I was Judas. So yeah, it was there even amongst the loving.
Thank you. Yes, up front, Dr. Mazansky. Hold on, just get the mic, Cyril.
I need to ask you a personal question from your personal point of view. I've read many of your books, and I understand when you say it's not up for me to say whether he should be beatified or not. I hear and read, and it pained me about the kidnapping book. So do you personally believe, from what you have written, especially with this, which I thank you so much for publishing this book, do you feel personally that there will be a fundamental change in the attitude in the Vatican, particularly with the large conservative element that exists there? Or do you think it's going to be business as usual as it's been for the past nearly 2,000 years?
Well, in fact, if you go, as I do on Twitter, and put Pius XII in, you will most days see many tweets which say Pius XII was the last pope. There has been no legitimate pope after Pius XII. So there's a right wing of the church for which why is he the last pope? Because the church went off the tracks with the Second Vatican Council, including Nostra Aetate and changing its policy with respect to the Jews. So the loudest group for making a saint of Pius XII is in fact the big opponent of the current pope, of Pope Francis. And where is the epicenter of this? It's not in Poland, it's in the United States. The American church is the kind of leading force for reaction in the Catholic Church right now, which includes this Jewish question. So, when will this change? A lot has changed for the good, thanks in good part to the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate, and John Paul II's visit to the synagogue in Rome and so forth. But there's obviously still a lot of resistance as well, and special resistance to coming to terms with I think, with this history that we've been talking about.
Okay. Yes, up here. But just give it 1 second so you have the microphone, please, ma'am.
Have you considered working with your publisher and placing small sections of your book which reveal how the Pope behaved and how the higher-ups in the church behaved in articles, in newspapers, in magazines, on media, on television, so that the general public will learn about this? Because the truth of the matter is, there is a select audience, which is limited, which will read your book. And this information should get out to the public. So I think the question now really is, how are we going to get this information out to the public? Otherwise, and I don't mean to be nasty about it, it's an effort that will not be rewarded.
Well, of course, this is exactly what I would hope would happen, and I think with people here by Zoom, getting the word out, is an important. New York Times did not review the book, nor did Wall Street Journal. There was a very nice review in the Washington Post. I did try to, I've written a couple of articles that are published in The Atlantic that I think I referred to, one on the Finley case, one on, in fact, on von Hessen and this Nazi prince that's the secret go-between between Hitler and the Pope. So that has been an effort to get the word out about some of the results of this book. When the day the book came out, Judy Woodruff in that the PBS NewsHour program did a 5-minute interview, and that certainly helped for see a big uptick briefly in the sale of the book. It would be nice, and this gets a bit to Abe's question about how come no Jewish organizations have shown any interest in getting the word out about this research that I know about. We're open to suggestion.
It's not that simple. So I'll share with you when Pope John Paul came to the U.S. first time, I did an article, Polish Jew meets a Polish Catholic. It was after my first meeting. And so through the ADL, we submitted it. And when the Pope came to Boston, the Boston Herald ran it on the front page. The Daily News committed to taking it on the front page on the day that the Pope visits. The Pope visits, I buy the Daily News, Nishtu, Gornish. A couple of phone calls, what happened? There were other phone calls made to the Daily News that said it's not the way that they want to welcome the Pope. And it was a beautiful story. It was a story of the humanity of the church, and even that, they weren't comfortable. So, yeah, we'll try, but it's not as simple as saying, let's do it.
Okay, let's do one more here. Yeah.
Was it pious or institutional? If it was a different pope, would it still have happened?
Let's say it one more time, sir, just so we can.
Was it Pope Pius or more institutional? If it was a different pope, might it have been different?
Yeah, of course, conjectural history is always difficult. I think the question is often posed about the predecessors. I mentioned Pius XI was a very different personality. I mentioned how angry he was at Hitler and at Mussolini for embracing Hitler. Of course, the church had embraced Mussolini and was a major pillar of the Italian fascist regime. But the Pius XI, who was part of that effort, was not happy about the embrace of Hitler, who he saw as a pagan who was trying to undermine the church in Germany. And he was someone he would pound his fist on his table if he was angry at an ambassador, what their country was doing, something that Pius XII would never do. He was much too much of a diplomat and didn't want to offend people and so forth. So, what if Pius XI had remained the Pope? What would have happened? It wasn't that there were radically different attitudes toward Jews between the popes. They both were steeped in a certain kind of general anti-Semitism that was pervaded in the church. One question I asked, I talked about the difficulty Mussolini had in convincing Italians to go to war. How much influence the popes had, let's say, with Germany is, I think, open to question. First of all, the Catholics were a minority, albeit a big minority. In Italy, about 99% of the population was Catholic. Not only the Pope was Roman, Pacelli, Pius XII, but virtually the entire curia, the cardinals who head all the central departments of the church, 23 out of 24 were Italian at that time during the war. so the influence the Pope had in Italy, and which, by the way, begins not with the Holocaust, but with the introduction of the racial laws in 1938, which threw virtually all of Italy's Jews out of their jobs, impoverished them, threw all Jewish children out of the schools. The church never protested, except insofar as baptized Jews were being treated as Jews. That was the one thing they protested. So, so we have to go back, in fact, to Pius XI. If Pius XI had actually called on all parish priests, I mean, they had thousands of parish priests throughout Italy, to preach that no one should go along with this, it would have made a huge difference, but they didn't do that. So, yeah, there could have been a different history here.
So the answer is yes, both.
Right.
The person and the church.
Yeah.
So I want to use my prerogative to ask both of you gentlemen a final question, slightly different, but Professor Kertzer, you're not the first Kertzer to speak on this pulpit. Your father of blessed memory, Rabbi Morris Kertzer, served this congregation with distinction. And as you yourself noted, he led services for the U.S. troops on the Anzio beachhead, and on that first Friday night of freedom, he led 4,000 Jews in the Shehechianu prayer, and one thinks of his legacy with the honor of you being on the pulpit here this evening. I was struck as I did my own research on your father, his leadership in the war as a chaplain, National Director of Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee, a receiver of honor for his promotion of Catholic Jewish understanding. But it was a small piece that I saw that in 1956, your father was amongst a delegation of rabbis who visited the Soviet Union to check in on the status of the Jewish community. A very, very different story. And the quote that I found was, "We have seen and heard, what we have seen and heard leads us to the melancholy conclusion that Judaism in Russia is seriously threatened with extinction." So your book, as I read it, is so many things, and such a rich and important contribution to the scholarship of this dark chapter of human history. But it's also a meditation on the enabling power of silence, whether it is during the Holocaust, whether it's Soviet Jewry, and that in this sense, I'll share with you, perhaps as only a rabbi can, that this book is a true fulfillment of the mitzvah of Kibud Av, of honoring your father of blessed memory. And so perhaps, Abe, you can begin, and Professor, you can have the final word on this question of leadership and the sin of silence. Whether it is, you have spoken up time and time again, right up until the recent news cycle, of the importance of individual Jews, certainly religious leadership, to stand up and speak to the issues of the day. Give us a few words, Abe, on the role of not being complicit.
The crematoria in Auschwitz did not begin with bricks, they began with words. These words were permitted to become bricks in the absence of words. So words, we know in our tradition, Rabbi, in our tradition, we say 3 times a day, those who pray, "Nitzor l'shoni mira," keep my mouth from speaking evil. On Yom Kippur, we say al chait so many times of the sins of the mount. So we know the power of the tongue is for good, is life and death. And so silence is as deadly as evil words. We're seeing now, we're seeing all kinds of things, but part of speaking is telling the truth. All anti-Semitism is a big lie. All racism is a big lie. And the answer to the big lie is the truth, and you need to speak the truth. Well, we've lost truth, but we have silence. People are intimidated to speak. And even here, what troubles me is from my life, from my world, I waited for this book 50 years. 50 years, I did not know that I would live to see the moment where the truth that I knew in my kishke was there would be laid bare for the world. And it's silence. It's silence, because there's intimidation and fear. So we have an obligation to speak out. We have an obligation to say no. And it seems to, it's harder. We see it in Israel, certainly saw it here in the last 6-8 years. And yet, that's the antidote to hate, to the lies, is the voice of truth. And there it is, and we're trying to give it life and breath.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of end this evening, which does have a nostalgic quality for me for the reasons you mentioned, by reflecting on my father and why did he leave? After the war, he came to Park Avenue Synagogue as the associate rabbi. The senior rabbi was Milton Steinberg, who became my godfather when I was born in 1948 here. But he left a year later because he became the first director of interreligious affairs of the American Jewish Committee, where he then spent the next 12 years building up that office. And it was in the wake of the Holocaust that why was this created at that time? That the need for dealing with the demonization of Jews in not only Catholic but also Protestant churches and what children were being taught in their Sunday schools and so on became so important. So sometimes I'm asked, well, your father worked so hard and he worked with Catholic clergy along with Protestant clergy for greater understanding, and you seem to be operating against this somehow, that because you seem to be criticizing it, and I'm certainly being denounced by the Vatican right now, who greeted the Italian publication of my book with a full page of denunciation. But I see things the opposite, really, that we need to come to terms with this history, and it's not through some desire to beat on the church. I see this as a sore that's only going to go away by coming to terms with what actually happened and why it happened. And as long as the church refuses, now here when I say the church, of course, the church is a very variegated institution. There are many Catholics, including many Catholic authors and priests and so on, who are desperate to come to terms with this history. But the official position of the Vatican is what it is. The official position of the Italian Catholic Church, for one thing, is what it is. And as long as there's this refusal to come to terms with the history, I think it is incumbent upon those of us who do have access to the ability to unearth this history, to try to bring it to light and try to get us all to understand it, understand how it happened, and in part so that we prevent the evil that was the consequence.
Professor, thank you for this publication, The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini and Hitler. Abe Foxman, thank you for joining us here, honoring us with your presence. Not only are there copies of the book available for you, but I think I know, not to little children, but to the people at my Seder, what the prize for the Afikomen is going to be, because I think in the more hands we can get this publication in, we'll be fulfilling the mitzvah of bringing light to darkness and truth to this world. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much.